Renowned American musician, producer, and songwriter Mark Plati is primarily known for his extensive work with David Bowie, starting off in 1996 by co-producing the album Earthling, and which began a period up until 2003, where he produced, recorded, remixed, became musical director, and even performed live with the legendary Bowie.
This is Bowie-esque, right? I'm doing something totally different. Something in sound and rhythm spoke to me on some really molecular level, I guess. It drew me in more than a lot of people I knew. He just wanted to see what you do you got, kind of, and run with it. So I started out as an engineer programmer. I ended up being a co-writer and mixer on that first record, Earthling. And then the next record, I wasn't even going to do it. And then they called me to play fretless bass.
When Bowie died, can you remember that day and what impact did it have? So the interview with Mark Plati is coming up in seconds, but just time to ask you to like, subscribe, and please become a member because it helps me continue with this podcast. So Mark Plati, welcome. Where do we find you?
We find me in the East Village in Manhattan in New York City.
In your studio?
In my studio, yes, where I've been for many years now.
I want to talk about your childhood because I always think that the childhood has a great impact on someone's life, not just what you learn in the childhood, but what, happens in the childhood. So first of all, tell me about the music you were brought up around.
Well, I was a kid in the 60s. So we were brought up around glorious AM pop radio, sort of post-Beatles, I guess you'd call it, which was full of everything at the time from, I don't know, how would I say, from Burt Bacharach to Burt Bacharach to Steppenwolf to The Fifth Dimension to anything in the middle, anything in between. We were all, it was all over the musical spectrum.
That's what your parents listened to, was it?
Yeah, most of this came from the car radio.
What was their relation to music? Did they have any connection to music apart from listening to it?
Not that I was aware of at the time. There was definitely a familial, predisposition to it because I found out later that my grandfather was an opera singer and he had auditioned for the Met, but they wanted him to travel and he already had sort of family and all that, so he couldn't do that. So he kind of confined his musical endeavors to things like weddings and public events and things like that. And my aunt was a singer and piano teacher, but there was really no discussion about getting into music or being a musical person. In fact, if anything, it was the other way about let's all be doctors and lawyers and things steady jobs.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's still the mention of wanting a creative life to my parents would have sort of blown their minds. It would have been, why don't you earn some money?
Exactly. I mean, you want your kids to prosper and all, and I completely understand that. And at the time, especially around then, being a musician was maybe not the greatest idea. So I could
music for me was an escape, not just sort of going to my room and listening to music, but it was escape from my parents' world. What was it for you?
I'm not really sure what it was. It was, of course, an escape because in part it was, we were full-on generation gap kids. Our parents were them and we were us and our music belonged to us. It's not the same with my kids. I'll catch my kids listening to Neil Young or something, and that you wouldn't have caught. I'm sure you could say the same thing. You wouldn't have caught me listening to Frank Sinatra. Wouldn't have happened, right? It was our world. But I don't really know. Other than that, just I don't know. Something in sound and rhythm spoke to me on some really molecular level, I guess, because it just, it drew me in more than a lot of people I knew.
I mean, obviously, we're going to talk a lot about Bowie later, but if I think of myself as a teenager, and I'm a gay man, so I was a gay kid, listening to Bowie, and Bowie provided a world of belonging that I didn't have. It was such an important figure in those terms. And I just wondered if there was an artist when you were growing up who provided some form of identity, belonging, something else.
Other than the fact that, all this music belonged to us kids, not really a particular one. I mean, I liked I was more tuned into, I guess, the musical side of it all and what it sort of, how it stirred me, I guess I'd say. So in terms of having, one artist that really moved me, I was a little unfaithful in that way. There wasn't one that kind of like, oh, because if they made a record I didn't like, or at the time I'd be like, oh, then I'll just move over to the right or to the left. It just wouldn't, it'd be more like that. Whereas, and of course, having had my experience with David and all, I see that with his fans, they're a lot more, how would I say, they're a lot more patient and willing to give it a go with, new work of his. And, he would push that. Definitely. And folks who follow along, it's quite impressive.
When you read your biography, it does really sound like there was no other path that you were going to take. Was it really like that? Because it seems like you were sort of a prodigy as a child, and you were always into music and always, taking a path that would eventually lead you to where you are today.
I'm not sure that I think it's kind of, maybe it's along the line of a calling, you're going to do this and you might fight it, but it's not going to happen. And I did, actually. I mean, once I was, I got out of high school and I thought, okay, now I have to get serious. It's like time to whatever. Sold my instruments, went off to college. About 2 weeks later, I said, man, I'm an idiot. What am I doing? This is not, especially once I got out of the parental bubble and all of that. And it was sort of like, all right, it's just me. It's not my parents. It's not my friends. It's me. And what's that about? What do I really want? So then I kind of did a complete about face and got right back into it.
Did you have a particular mentor figure when you were young?
I suppose the one that really, I don't know about a mentor per se. I suppose, well, I guess one of my music teachers, Mr. Ellington, who was a cousin of Duke Ellington, he really kind of opened my eyes as far as what this could be about, because he didn't treat us like, on some level, it didn't treat us like students. And once I learned enough to get around, say, on bass, and he would say, all right, it's time to take a solo. I said, I don't know how to solo. Well, do it anyway. Just, I ended up started doing little small gigs with him. So I kind of got a taste of, the real world. This is kind of what it's like out here. I got a little taste of that as a teenager. We did a recording session. Our jazz band did a recording session. I was about 16, I think, in the studio. And even though that session was pretty rushed, and you could tell the studio people were like, oh, they're just kids, and we'll get them in and out and whatever. And we got one chance to play everything. We got one playback in the control room. That was it. But still, you felt like, wow, this is, this isn't plunking around on stuff in my bedroom now. This is something else. So he really, we went to, did a couple of road trips. We went to Berkeley. So we were being young, traveling musicians. So we got a real, my eyes were kind of open to, what it could be about.
Well, tell me about that then, because in that sense, at that time, what was it about for you?
Playing music with people and getting the feeling like, wow, this could really be something. And how does one do that when, you know, you're then confronted with these other, you know, influences of like, well, this is just fun. And I was always had the feeling like, well, it's really not just fun, is it? It's not fun for me. Like the way music hits me, I don't know that I'd call that. I mean, it can be fun, of course, but just, you know, it's moving, and that's beyond fun. It's a
So
big
how
step.
did you find that first moment in a recording studio? Were you overwhelmed in any way, or was it something where you were totally intrigued about what happens here?
That happened a couple of years later when a friend of mine who was in a local cover band, they decided to go into a studio and record a couple of their own songs. And I just went to hang out with them. And I just watched the process kind of unfold and the way that things got, you know, put together. And it just was really intriguing to me. Like, wow, this is, you know, seeing the nuts and bolts of that. And this is around 1981, I guess. I'm around 18 or something, 19 years old. And it just, I don't know, that kind of floored me. Like, wow, this is a kind of great little workaround for this whole like being a musician exclusively thing. You know, like, wow, it's like you know, this can be a real job, like being an engineer, but it's musical. So this could be a thing, right? This could be something. And a lot easier for the parents to swallow. That word engineer is kind of meaningful, right? Like, it's
Has the ring of money to it, that's why.
ability, of respectability of like, he's an engineer. Like, you know what I mean? Kind of, you know, they don't know what that means, of course. Like, well, you know, I'll be on a 30-hour session and there'll be like people smoking things and there'll be all kinds of whoever's in there and, you know, interesting characters. They don't need to know any of that. So, but hey, that was kind of my little workaround as far as, you know, adding some legitimacy to the things that I was wanting to do. But of course, I never stopped playing.
I mean, there were some years that you were learning that craft. I mean, I presume you're like, it's forever learning the craft in a way. But there were some years you were learning that craft. What was the difference in that period of learning that craft and then working with someone like Arthur Baker?
Well, learning, it was, you know, kind of a continuum, really. I mean, you start learning and seeing how things get done and how you can do them. And you know, I started doing live sound after that for a while. And you just get and when you know, where I went to school, they were very into you being, you know, well-rounded like that, like doing live sound, doing recordings, learning how to fix things and learning some, you know, basic electrical theory, just so that like when you get in a place like this and something goes down, it's like, oh, I can, you know, I can fix that, or at least I can diagnose it enough that I can get somebody, you know, up a level for me to fix it. So they were very into us being prepared to go out in the world and do that.
So tell me about when you first started working for Arthur Baker, in what sort of development were you as a person? Were you aware of how you deal with an artist, you know, who's got a history and is making, you know, producing great music? So, and how you deal with them, or were you just a sort of still a kid going into that arena?
Just getting in the door there was a huge lesson in what was going to happen to me. Because I didn't have any grand designs on working with Arthur Baker. I barely knew what remixing was. I just seen his name on a couple of records, go, that's interesting, whatever that means, remixing. And, you know, when I got out of school, I did an internship in Texas where I really worked a lot and got my act really totally together. And I thought, I'm going to go to New York City now and I'm going to work at the power station and be like rock engineer, mixer guy, you know, the next Bob Clearmountain. Everybody wanted to be the next Bob Clearmountain around that time. Power station, nah, didn't need anybody. I went all over the city. Nobody needed anybody. And I'm like fancy myself rock engineer, bass player guy. That's me. And then I said, well, I can wait around, or one of them would give me like a position as the tea boy or whatever. And I said, well, I'm a little too far down the road to start over as the tea boy. So I said, well, I'll look at sort of second tier studios, and I just landed at Arthur's studio, Shakedown, and they needed an assistant. And I said, cool, all right. Even though I didn't know what I was doing, as far as I knew what MIDI was. I knew the idea behind MIDI sequencing. So I just said, yeah, cool, I can do that.
Did he know you didn't know what you were doing?
No, not at all. Not at all. I basically had the energy of somebody in their 20s, and I stayed up all night reading manuals and experimenting and basically winged it, But what got me through all of that was having a real basic musicality, because I realized that a lot of engineers and mixers and things didn't have what I had in that sense, didn't have this, they weren't musicians. They knew a little, if they weren't musicians. So I had a lot of that going for me, especially when it came time to do sessions like that, overdub sessions. And I realized I was working with a lot of people that also weren't quite as musically together as I was. And a lot of this involved like putting samples in music, and they'd be like, doesn't sound right. What's wrong with that? And I'd say, well, that's B flat and that's A. You got to, unless you want that to get that clash, one of them's got to agree. And they would never know what they're like. What? Well, just fix it. It would just so. Arthur learned early on I was pretty valuable for that, and for playing overdubs and things like this. So that kind of put me in a slightly different class than a lot of the other folks working there, because they just didn't have that knowledge.
And you were working directly with artists as well at that period. It wasn't just sort of remixing separately from the artists. You were there.
Well, not all the time. A lot of times, my discography gives this impression that, wow, all these people were here. And it's like most of the time they weren't. Most of the time they would send in multi-track tapes. We do the mixing and do the versions and send it back to them. Occasionally somebody would come. Like Lou Reed did. Lou Reed came for a few days, actually. Arif Mardin came when we were doing a Bee Gees remix, and he was great. He was really, it was amazing to meet him. He was one of these producers whose name you read growing up and go, wow, and what's he like? And that was great. We'd meet also, but we would, a lot of New York session musicians would come in, and that was exciting to me as well.
So did you sort of find a niche within Arthur Baker's setup, because you had this musicianship, which was something needed and different?
Absolutely, because sometimes I would end up playing on things, and that just wasn't, nobody else was doing that. I would end up, doing some MIDI sequencing. I would end up playing some, keyboard parts because I was there and I was good value for money and all that. So, and Arthur had there were no rules there about, like at other studios, like, well, you have to be, the gopher for 6 months and then you move up to this. And there were no rules there. It was just like, if you were in the building and you could do something, he was going to use you. So I kind of, I compared this in the fact that, like, friends of mine that had gone and got gigs at those kind of studios, they were still assisting, and I'd mixed my first, I'd done my first full-on mixed remix for Arthur after 9 months.
So at first he was giving you direction, and then later he had this trust in you knowing what to bring and what to do.
Well, sure. After, it's like with anybody, once they figure out what you can do, as long as they're not like some kind of super micromanager, then, that's what I would do. I'd be, oh, he can do this. Let him, that's one less worry for me if I know that such and such can do that without me looking over the shoulder. So, sorry, it was kind of like that.
Did Al Green come in?
No.
Oh, God, I had the best moment of my life at the Tabernacle Church in Memphis when Al Green, while I was
Oh,
interviewing him, decided he was going to give me a concert.
man. Oh my God.
So
Right.
anyhow, just an aside. You said that you've learned a lot from artists who come through the doors, but also learn things that you didn't want without giving any names. Can you give me sort of examples of just to get an understanding of what that really means?
Uh, Being open to ideas and being patient and not having a huge ego. I saw a lot of that, and I thought, well, that's kind of pretty detrimental to what we're trying to do here. It's like, well, I have an idea. My idea is the best idea. You know, I'm not going to listen to anything else. And I always thought that was a little bit, narrow-minded, especially in a creative area. Like, well, I mean, and balance that against somebody having a vision. Like, okay, I get if you have a vision, but then sometimes you see it like, all right, this is just politics. This is just like, I want it, and therefore, and I saw that more than a few times, and I just thought, this is not why we're doing this. Now, this is not why we're supposed to be doing this. This is not the reason for this. Like,
It's interesting because, I mean, even in my work in the past, that if I look at myself and being at that point where I feel like I know better or something, it's a sign. I look back and go, actually, it was insecurity.
there's that too. I mean, and I have to say as well for my own self, like when you start doing this, everybody wants to, not everybody, but at that time, you had artists like Prince and Todd Rundgren, and these guys were doing it all themselves, producing, engineering, writing, playing, right, the whole thing. And people want to do that, like, oh, I did the whole thing, and I had a bit of the period of that, like, well, if I'm recording this, I should mix it, and play the whatever. And over time, I just, started to say, well, I don't have to do that. It's kind of, is it better if other people are pitching in that, and then I can, especially once I started producing, like, well, if I'm doing all of that, my objectivity is going to go right out the window. I'm going to be too deep into it, and somebody has to kind of, and that was a great lesson from David, actually, because he would gather his people like a casting director and kind of, I guess, size them up and let them go and do your thing, bring your thing, and he would kind of steer, but not in a micromanaging kind of way. Occasionally he would have a vision of something he wanted very specifically, but that was occasionally. Most of the time, he just wanted to see what do you got, kind of, and run with it.
I mean, he also chose people before, didn't he? So he must have done some research into who he was going to wanted to work with. I mean, Kevin Armstrong told me, about the time that he was sent to Abbey Road and to wait for whoever was going to turn up, and it was Bowie. Now, Bowie must have known who he was getting. He must have known about the person. So I presume in a similar way with you, did he know of you before?
I think he got wind of my discography, especially because the first thing I did with him was Telling Lies, because they'd done a demo of it and he wanted to work on it further, but he needed somebody that could program as well as engineer. So and he was going to the Looking Glass studio, and I had a room there, so it just seemed natural to pair us. for this 1 week we were supposed to work together, and but I saw that with him too. Like when I introduced him to Jerry Leonard, Jerry never left. Like I never left. Like he would like work with somebody, go, he would dial into them and say, oh, this person can do things. In my case, he kind of moved me around the chessboard quite a bit. Like, oh, this, because I started out as an engineer programmer. I ended up being a co-writer and mixer on that first record, Earthling. And then the next record, I wasn't even going to do it. And then they called me to play fretless bass. I was like, cool. This is Bowie-esque, right? I'm doing something totally different, right? That was kind of, I was hoping for that, like left field switch, right? Let's do it. So that was very exciting. And then I ended up in the band by kind of circumstance or accident or what have you again. And he's like, oh, well, he's cool in the band now. And then I was that guy. So, but he would see things in people. There's a story about him basically seeing Gail on TV, like 5 years or 4 years before he worked with her, just making a note like, ooh, Gail. And then, then that was that,
What I think is really fascinating is that on one side, he seems to know exactly what he's looking for. And I just wondered how much you knew about him. Obviously, everyone knows Bowie, but how much of his work you knew before he actually walked into Looking Glass?
Well, I grew up with him, of course, in varying stages, of course. I think the first thing I ever heard was probably Space Oddity when I was maybe around 10 or 11 years old or something. And I knew of him and all that. I mean, how could you not notice David Bowie? I remember being in the record store with my dad, and he was looking at the Diamond Dogs cover going, what is that about? And I'm thinking, cool. It's just like, again, like with the whole, separation, generation gap thing, like, oh, wow, cool. But really, I think the first record that I was aware of as a record was Station to Station. Because at that time, now we've progressed from AM pop radio to sort of long free-form FM radio by the time I'm like, 12 or 13 or whatever. And they used to just play big chunks of Station to Station on the radio, if you can believe that. That's where I first heard it, was on the radio before ever having the album. And that really sort of stuck with me. And then I was fairly tuned into him until around Let's Dance, and I kind of fell off the train around there or wherever, after that. Just I was just into so many things by then that, I wasn't following anybody that closely. I was just, had my ears in so many little areas.
And one of the fascinating things about Bowie and his music, I mean, the initial impression is one thing and hearing the music is another, but then there is this layered thing of an intellectual quality of when and I remember reading the music press and then finding out, oh, wow, he's into this. He's done it in this way. He does cut-ups in his Burroughs cut-ups in his techniques of writing, and he does this and that and the other, and he's the books that he was into. And then it was, for me, the first artist that had these immense layers. When were you aware of all those things? And I don't mean it in a superficial way, but not just the music.
I was always a little, because you'd pick up things in interviews you'd read, like you just said. But I think when I started working with them, I would just see it. They actually brought in that computer, this sort of randomizer, verbicizer for cut-ups, right? But he didn't use it. Instead, he sat back on the couch and writing things on Post-its, putting it on a music stand and singing it. So he just didn't feel it on that record. But he and Reeves would go out to art galleries. One time, David Lynch showed up. people would just show up like that. Uh, so, and there'd just be discussions. I mean, one thing I missed when I left was, was just the hang, just like all these things getting discussed. And, you just felt yourself, I've said this before, like you just felt yourself getting smarter being there, because he was always on the hunt, always exploring for something, just curious, eternally curious. And that was something that, again, you start to say, well, why shouldn't we be curious? I think one of the things about working with him that really struck me was just this whole validation of, yeah, why can't it be like this? Because you're sort of told like, well, we have to make music one way, you have to, and he was not doing that, Why do we have to make the same record over and over? And I had already begun to feel that from like the record industry, like, this is your sound, this is the guy you are. And I was like, no, it's not. I mean, why am I in a box? So that it's easier for you to do your job? I'm not in a box. I'm all over the shop because that's what I grew up with and that's what interests me. I don't want to make the same record over and over. How boring would that be? I mean, really. So that was really for me just, yes, this is what we should all be. We should all be like David.
Yes, we should all be like David, but more about Plati in a second. Just time for me to ask you to like, subscribe, but please become a member because it helps me continue with the podcast. He was an educator in some way, wasn't he? Because I remember talking to Mark Waddell, who's a British artist, who a lot of his art is based on Bowie. And he, I think he was a 18-year-old or something, and sent Bowie a letter. And Bowie replied and told him to read, gave him a list of books and said, this will help you, basically.
Yeah, he was really into sharing it. He was excited by it. It's like, ooh, check this out. Ooh, and that it wasn't like, well, this is, way above your head, or, you're not the kind of person I would, never anything like that, So he was really anxious to like, to share all these things he learned.
What would he bring into the studio? What was it, I don't know how to sort of put this, but what sort of level of demo was it? What, he'd bring something raw into the studio and then work on that? Or would he come in without an idea and have an idea in the studio? Or was it a combination of things?
It was different every time. Yeah, like when we did Earthling, we just kind of wrote it on the spot. He told me to come up with some tracks and contribute them, and we'd work on them. And Reeves had ideas that he'd been kind of working on. We just pooled all this stuff together and sort of did a pick and choose of, let's start working on this idea. And then it would kind of, grow from that. So there was that method. There was also a couple times he'd done home demos, brought them in, and we sort of adapted ideas from those. Okay, let's use this part, and then we'll add, some of the band to that. So there wasn't any set method that I saw other than what he felt like at the moment was cool.
And in terms of contribution, what do you think, because you worked with him for such a long time, what do you think he specifically saw in you that was valuable to him? That's
tricky. You'd have to, I don't know. I mean, just other than, my musical and sonic sensibility made sense to him, and what I could contribute was of value to what he was trying to do. Because there was never, there was sometimes there was direction, try to play this, but a lot of the time it was, like I was doing bass parts, there was not a word about like, maybe that's too low, or maybe let's try this. It was just like on my own, and he trusted that. There was sometimes some keyboard parts. He had a melody he wanted to sort of incorporate. Okay, and otherwise, you know, or I would say, well, maybe this one needs an acoustic guitar with it, and he's like, okay. Yeah, he would just let you go, and if it didn't work, then it didn't work, or he'd have an idea and you'd try it, and maybe it wouldn't work, but you'd get a sort of another idea from that. And that was always cool because you just never knew where it was going to go. It was really exciting.
He made you musical director as well. Was that for Glastonbury?
It was for Glastonbury, and it was for the tour before that, because Reeves had left. So he made me, and I even said to him, like, well, I've never been MD, like, and he said, oh, it's easy. You're just like being a producer, but you're on the bus. I'm like, oh, okay.
And was it?
Well, the only rule was you can't fire anybody because you're in a tour and stuff, and that's not, it's not like in a session where if somebody's not working out, then you go thank you and then whatever. But you can't really, you've got the lineup that you've got, and you can't really mess with that. So, which makes sense, of course, because you're not going to like replace somebody on the road. It's not going to work unless, for musical reasons anyway. So, and yeah, I did find it to be pretty similar,
Maybe the first show isn't exactly how you feel it should be. So how do you take that and make it change for it to really start shining all the way through?
Well, if there's an issue with something, then you just have well, how I do it. Again, this gets into areas of ego and politics, and but I just have a conversation with somebody. Okay, well, maybe this section you could lay back a little bit. Maybe over there, you could add a little more. Maybe, we don't need those backing vocals in this section. Just approaching it, in ways like that.
Would he leave that to you, or would that be also a discussion you would have with him first?
He'd leave that to me unless he had a specific thought about something, of course, or say, well, maybe that song, we shouldn't be doing that. I would work on the set list with him. That's something we would do. But I knew from other experiences and from other artists that sometimes the band leader could not be an easy person to deal with. And David said I was a great MD, and which made sense to me because that's how I work in the studio. I'm sort of, I don't lord over everybody because I don't want to be lorded over either, because I know, like, if somebody, tries to do that to me creatively, that's going to shut me down. I'm not going to be so open to things if somebody's just like, if somebody's an asshole, or if somebody's, not open to what I've got to contribute, or can steer in a positive direction, So that's how I do it. So he was very, very happy with that.
How was the experience of being on a stage with Bowie playing to, a Glastonbury, absolutely massive audiences?
Oh, it was intense. It was totally different than being in studio with him. Completely different. I remember the first show I did with him was VH1 Storytellers, which was really scary.
Why?
Because it was a really small room. There weren't that many people in that audience. And for me, smaller gigs are harder than bigger gigs. Like stadium gigs are nothing. You can't really see anybody. They're too far away, and there's too many of them. It's just, it's a spectacle. Don't get me wrong. It's something like, wow, humanity. Like, but when they're right there and they're maybe like, a meter away from you, like, whoa, and they're just watching you, and then you're next to him, and like, wow, I gotta deliver, man. I have to really be focused and deliver. So I was a little out of my, not out of my head, but, a little bit in an altered reality there for a minute. Like, wow. and and just and seeing I'd never seen him perform. Actually, I'd never even been to a Bowie concert, for one. Never been to a Bowie show. So then seeing him perform, and I'm right next to him, that was something. Then it's like, wow. And it was always funny because one of the backing singers had never done this before, and occasionally she would look over at me and mouth like, "I don't believe this." I'm like, you know, and there would be surreal moments like that. I think one of the most intense things I ever musically felt or otherwise was doing Station to Station. And the first time we did it at Roseland, and I'm in this triangle between David Bowie, Mike Garson, and Earl Slick. And they're all looking at me for cues. I was just like, I don't believe this. Like, how did I land here? You know? And I thought that for about half a second, and then I was like, all right, back to work. But there were a few moments like that where you just don't believe where you are.
I mean, he was one person. Okay, I've been at a press conference where he suddenly asked me what I wanted to hear when he played, because he recognized me from MTV in Europe at that point. So he had that connection. Then I've obviously seen him in concert when I was young, and I interviewed him later on. And what really shocked me was his charisma in a interview was as intense as it was on stage. And it's very rare, you don't always interview people who have this amazing charisma in a room together, sort of thing. Did he always have that? Was that always there?
I hadn't really thought about it like that, but to me, he was always the same person. There wasn't like an on stage, other than playing dress up and stuff, right? Like, but there was no on stage other person. It was always the same person to me. Yeah, I'd never really thought like, no, he doesn't put on a game face, for example. No, it's always the same person.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think a lot of artists do, but it's a protection, because obviously it ain't easy. I mean, everyone thinks, yeah, it'll be brilliant to be David Bowie or whatever, but it isn't easy. When I interviewed Madonna, she talked about Madonna in the third person, which made me think, oh my God, so she's protecting herself by thinking, well, by saying, what would Madonna say?
Wow, interesting. That's interesting.
What do you think you gleaned from Bowie that has helped you in your career since?
Well, he never referred to himself as in the third person. There's that. Uh, I've never done. Again, it goes back to this point of like validation of seeing how he did it, doing it in a way I thought that's the way the world should work, and that just gave me sort of the motivation to just pursue that. Like, all right, this is this is real. This can be real, and I've tried to do that, ever since. To have this sort of openness and curiosity about things, to nurture that openness and curiosity about things, and not be not succumb to any pressure to be this one sonic or musical entity.
Was Bowie the definition of an artist for you?
Absolutely.
So how would you define an artist?
Well, I guess an artist is somebody that has a vision and goes to lengths to, see what that vision's about. I guess you could use that definition in any number of fields. I mean, like, was Henry Ford an artist? Things like this. That's kind of, we tend to think of like, an artist being in sort of the fine arts and being in music, and and everything. But what is an artist? That's a really great question. And I saw that and I went, wow, that's that's pretty. That could be pretty broad. It's sort of as far as that goes. When I started to really think about it, and you know, that's I don't know. Maybe that's something David would even say. Like, what is an artist? Let's dive down into that. Like, what is an artist? I could see having a big discussion with him over what an artist really is, and maybe that's what it is. That's maybe being an artist is just questioning lots of things and not going with the status quo and trying to find a path you feel is for you, and maybe that path isn't the same all the time. It certainly wasn't for him, right? I mean, he would, even in the time I was with him, I mean, how many, scene changes was that about? I mean, between Earthling and Reality, like, wow, fantastic.
After Glastonbury, you worked on Toy, and you mentioned earlier that Space Oddity is where you got to know Bowie. So had you heard at that point his early work?
None of it. Not a lick. Which was good, actually. It was good because I had complete objectivity. And I didn't want to hear them either. And he had no we listened to them originally just to pick the songs themselves, right? But then I didn't listen to them again because I didn't want to subconsciously or unconsciously like try to incorporate any of that into these new recordings, because it's kind of that gets kind of tricky if you hear something a lot and you'll just kind of, oh God, that's from the other version, and you'll just do that. Or so I made a decision, I'm not going to listen to that again. Now that I've got charts and all that, I don't need to listen to the stuff again, which was good. And I wasn't familiar with it, and neither was the band really, which was also good, because then people could bring what they wanted to it. I mean, like on Toy, Gail's the bass player on Toy. And nobody told her anything. Nobody told her a word about what to play, right? Slicky, not a word. We just didn't, nothing. Like here's a chart. Here's the song. He's singing. We did it together as a band with him singing, and we rehearsed a couple of the songs because we did a couple of them. We did one at the BBC, didn't we? We did I Dig Everything at the BBC and London Boys. That's right. Actually, I played bass on London Boys because Gail played clarinet.
Did she know something about that?
She played clarinet in school band when she was a kid, right? So Dave was like, "Ooh, you can play clarinet." So, oh. And she's like, "Well, I haven't done it in a while." He's like, "Oh, you'll get it." So there was that kind of thing, and yeah, but it was basically go in and play these songs together as a band, and that was a really good band, really solid, tight band, tight little rock band. It was perfect for that. No, I listened to, actually yesterday on my playlist, Can't Help Thinking About Me just popped up. And first I was like, who are these people? This is killing. I was like, oh wait, it's us. It's just so exuberant and, and it's fantastic. But that's how we all felt.
When you listened to his early stuff at that point, were you able to really identify what this sort of latent talent that was really going to rise out of that?
Only in that he was, again, like all over the shop. Like, here's somebody that's trying things. And he never stopped that, never.
I mean, it was with his voice he was trying things, wasn't he? He had a different, the Anthony Newley type
Absolutely.
voice. The very different music that he was doing and the different covers that he was doing back then.
It's like, okay, I can adopt this persona. Why not? And you could see he was already doing that. He was already sort of violating conventional song composition with like, what's that chord doing in there? It's just, he felt like it, and I would occasionally, I would read some articles about, David's sort of, grasp of music theory and how he would consciously like, add this to that to, be part of this certain mode of whatever. And then I was like, that's pretty deep, and then I'd see him writing a song. He's like, oh, I just like the sound of that. Like, oh, yes, of course. You just like the sound of it. That's, it's funny because sometimes, analysis can just be looking for, it can be wishful thinking, sometimes when you read things like, well, maybe, but it kind of wasn't like that. It was more about chance. That was something else with him, was this idea of chance, like with random lyrics, same idea, like just chance, like, oh, somebody make a mistake, you go, oh wait, and then I could build a whole new idea out of that. Things like that. And that's something else I try to, remember as well. Like, sometimes you just have to have your ears open for something that could be interesting, even if it's not, on the work schedule or whatever. Like, well, hey, that could be great, So to run with happy accidents.
When Bowie died, for all of us, and obviously it's very different for you, but for all of us, it had an impact because he was such a part of our lives. Although we didn't know him and we didn't work with him, you worked with him. Can you remember that day and what impact did it have? And who did you talk to first? Did you need to talk to someone first about it?
Well, I was actually in Italy when I saw the news on the BBC website, and I didn't believe it. I thought, because there'd been a hoax a couple of days before, a death hoax, somebody, I don't know, it wasn't somebody else, right? I was like, oh, it's another hoax, because I didn't know he was ill. He was keeping that pretty under wraps, and anybody he was working with had to sign an agreement to, keep quiet about it. So I didn't know. So then I waited a few hours and I called the office. It's like, and then they said, yeah, it's real, So it was, I don't know, it was a kick in the head, really. Like, wow, just, you kind of don't believe it. And it was twofold for me because, again, I was a fan growing up. That was always something with him, like, well, I have such a history with his music in a couple of different ways. So it was complicated. I mean, and then like an Italian newspaper called me to interview me, and I don't even remember what I said. It was just, I don't know. I don't know how you react to that. It was just like a big, somebody that was like this huge influence in your life, and they're no longer there. And it takes time to like come around to the fact that, yeah, but everything that you went through with them is still there. And it takes a minute, right? It's, I guess that's what grief is about. You have to just get through it, and then you can size it all up. So it took a bit,
One thing you're involved in today is the Bowie Celebration Tour. Can you tell me how that came about, and what sort of community is it of people that have all worked with Bowie? So it must be a really sort of fascinating group of people. I know it's different in different places, different groupings, but it's wherever you are, you're with people who have worked and had similar experiences of you.
Well, I did a couple of them a couple of times, like these tours. I did really kind of just the one with Mike. I did like a tour per se. I did a couple of other one-offs, but the one I do now, which is every January, we just did it, is one that's in New York that has mostly New York-based people in it, like Donnie McCaslin's in it, Gail, Henry Hay. Henry Hay actually and I are, we organize it. And it involves like Carmine Rojas. It's definitely this full, it's a big palette of people there, like that go through definitely different eras of David's career.
Do you discover more things about him because of doing this?
I don't know if so much more things about him as we're all tied, like a lot of things I've told you about, my working relationship with him is like, you'll tell somebody else that and they'll go, yeah, we've all had this experience together with him, not together, but like in our own times. Like, well, Gail and I were together, right? Carmine's before us. A couple of the folks are from Lazarus from the very end, right? Donnie's from Black Star. So, but it's all kind of the same. We all kind of we bond over what we've been through together, in a good way, of course. So it's nice to have like, I guess kindred spirits around.
Yeah, finally, I just want to end with a question, and it's a quote from you, and I want your comment on it because you said that my whole life has been trying to avoid the treadmill. Why is it important to avoid the treadmill? And is the treadmill sort of the death of creativity for you?
Yes, because it's boring. I don't want to be bored. I don't want to, I don't want to retire with a gold watch after doing the same thing for 40 years, that's what I don't want. And so far I've avoided that. I just want to be challenged, and feel like, oh, today I'm doing something else, and that is inherent in this. And like, okay, well, it's different music today, of course, but sometimes it's very different music. Sometimes it's playing something with somebody. Sometimes and producing is different with different people. It depends on who I'm working with and what input they want or need. And sometimes I'm just a sounding board, and sometimes I'm adding parts. Sometimes I'm doing more than that, less than that. So I never know what's coming until it comes. And to me, that's anti-treadmill territory.
Oh, that's brilliant. Mark Plati, it's been brilliant to meet you. And thank you for sharing your stories with me. And I want to thank you at the end as well because of your contribution to popular culture, because obviously it enriches our lives. And I would like to say thank you for that enrichment. Thank you, Mark.
That makes me, if I could add one thing, because I saw that and it made me think of a story that hit me. Because when I was a kid and how music moved me, there was that, and then I started to play and everything, and I'd play, concerts and bars and things and all that, whatever. And then when I was in college, I was part of a group and we went to Greece to play. We were an American choral group and I was a guitar player, and we were in Thessaloniki. We were in Athens, Crete, and went there. And I remember there, we were just playing on the street, and these people were so moved. And this little girl came up to me and pointed to her shirt and she said, Thessaloniki. Like, wow. And then I thought, you know what? Now I'm the one. I'm the one moving people, right? That was a kind of a real cornerstone, I guess, moment for me. Well, now I get to be that one, right? And now it's kind of a responsibility, right? Like it's my turn.
Mark, thanks so much. See you again.
Cheers.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.